Russia making more warnings over Finland's membership in NATO. The Finnish parliament is expected to approve its application as early as next week, ending the country's post-Second World War neutrality. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the Finns will be warmly welcomed into the alliance. The process would take as long as a year. Finland has one of the largest armies in Europe, and the country also shares a border with Russia, 1,300 kilometers long. So the Kremlin says Finland's joining NATO would be viewed as a definite threat to Russia. Finland further advanced along this road, but we know that in Sweden as well, the discussion ongoing, and we do expect to hear from Sweden too, similar moves within the next couple of days. The Swedish Foreign Minister talking about this today, how military non-alignment has served the country well, but Sweden too in a new situation. So Finland, Sweden joining NATO. That is the topic for our next conversation with someone you've met before as we followed the ongoing Russia war on Ukraine. With us is retired Major Michael Boire, who is a professor of history at the Royal Military College of Canada, but also a former NATO war planner, so has a particular insight for us this morning. Sir, welcome back. It's good to see you again this morning.
It's great to be here.
6 months ago, sir, if I had said Finland and Sweden look poised to join NATO, how would you have responded?
No way.
Exactly.
Both were very comfortable in their positions of neutrality. Those positions come from long history. And having served with officers from Finland and Sweden, I know how strongly that they adhered to that neutrality and to the strength that neutrality gave them. However, as we can all appreciate now, since February, the situation in their part of the world has changed. They must have been rattled, severely rattled by what happened in the Ukraine. And to seek the protection of NATO as part of NATO, it must have taken an awful lot of soul searching, but there it is, it's done now. So the threat in their eyes must have been very real. Now, the threat in Russian eyes is even more real, if I can use those words. Now that border between NATO's countries and Russia is much, much longer. That threat of being surrounded, if only metaphorically, is very strong in the Russian psyche. And now Putin has a real problem because he has to take an army already blooded by operations, as he calls them, in the Ukraine, and he has to make that armed force stretch across a much larger area because he's got to protect that part of the border, if only to be ready. To be ready in case, in his mind, NATO pulls something like an incursion, like a preemption. Well, of course, that's probably not going to happen, but that makes no difference in Putin's head. He's got real, serious problems now.
So, added to the problems by this, it seems, impending membership in NATO. It wouldn't be immediate. It's about a year-long process, even if accelerated before they'd be full-fledged members. But based on, again, so negative for Putin, based on what we know about the Finnish and Swedish military, how much of a plus is it then for the NATO alliance? Well,
it's a huge plus. Both Sweden and Finland have always taken the defense of their countries seriously. They were not lulled. They've never been lulled by a false sense of security coming from their neutral position. They have strong militaries. They're well-trained officers. I know officers in both organizations, and they're serious. They're very serious soldiers. They have a conscription. They have a conscription and professional elements in their army. Plus, even for small countries, because of the way they organize their defense, they have huge reserves of civilians who have had military training and are ready to, in fact, be called up to the colors. And not as important as the people, but significantly, there are very sophisticated defense industries, which are going to bring a level of sophistication to an already very well-developed alliance. It's going to take him a year to get into the alliance, and I say that having done that with the Polish in the 90s and early 2000s, because the staffs and the commanders in both armed forces, air, land, and sea, have to become acquainted with how NATO does business. The politics of the situation in an alliance is very tricky, and their politicians have to become trained to, in fact, operate that way in consensus. And building consensus among 30 nations is difficult. So the lot has to be done. But I underline the fact that Russia's position now militarily has changed significantly. In the same way our military posture changed when Russia crossed the Ukrainian border.
Right.
Now that same kind of stark reality, that sea change, is now facing the Russians.
And Russia has indicated already, even before membership has been accorded, that it is upset. Let me use some of the language that we're hearing from the Kremlin, that it views these moves from Finland and Sweden as a threat, and it, in response, is threatening retaliatory steps, including a military technical response. What is Russia's likely move in reaction to this?
Well, the things they have to do are redeployments. They have to spread the army across that frontier. They have to rearrange their air force to meet a threat coming across the northern borders. There's going to have to be some redeployment of naval operations in the Murmansk area, which is just north of Finland. So they have lots to do. So that immediate action is important. Secondarily, and perhaps contemporarily, also is the requirement in their minds to do a lot more on the cyber sphere to hopefully weaken that eventual northern Scandinavian position.
So does it make any sort of conflict directly Russia versus the West more or less likely, do you think?
Oh, more likely. More. Deep in the Russian psyche, and there's no way to overestimate this, there's a fear of borders. Fear of borders from the east and the fear of borders in the west. Remember, this nation has been invaded for the last 1,000 years from both points. So the notion of, and of course, especially since the Second World War and Hitler's devastating advance into Russia, the Russians are in fact very sensitive and very prone to see the worst possible happenings along their borders. So. I mean, I don't want to ascribe sincerity to what Russian politicians say, but Lavrov himself and his people at the UN have been saying that this is a threat, and that there will be a reaction. Now, what he does, we'll see. Most of what Mr. Putin says, and especially his secretaries say in public, is mere posturing. But one never knows when posturing ends and reality begins. He doesn't have the combat power. His armed forces don't have the combat power to take the fight to the Finns and the Swedes. That would be foolhardy. But he's got to make serious changes, because now he's operating on two fronts, in the north and in the south against Ukraine.
Thank you so much. As always, I really appreciate your very particular insight into all of this, and thanks for sharing it with us today, sir.
Why, thank you.
Retired Major Michael Boire in Kingston this morning.